So, as Taylor said, my name is Jill Rowland. I'm the director of the education program at the Alliance for Children's Rights. I know that earlier in this series, you've heard from one of my colleagues, David Noble, but just in case he didn't do a full intro, the Alliance is a nonprofit legal services organization, primarily doing direct legal advocacy for kids in LA County, but also doing policy advocacy statewide for our youth. We do a wide variety of things for kids, including finalizing about a third of the adoptions coming out of LA County, advocating to get kids access to education, gen ed, special ed, early ed services, healthcare and mental health services, supporting families seeking financial support to care for the children in their home, as well as working with youth who are transitioning out of the system. And as I said, we do policy work locally and statewide. In the ed team, we work with school districts to help them implement best practices to educate youth in the system, as well as things like putting out best practice guides, passing legislation, etc. So I'm really excited to be here with you all today. I'm going to be delivering some excerpts from a larger training that we have. I have provided the complete slide deck to Taylor and Brittany, and so I know they'll be sharing those with you at some point, but it is designed to be a 4-hour training, and you're just going to get kind of a small piece of it. So I want to be really clear about that from the outset. So I am going to go ahead and share. Hopefully you all can see. And one of the things you'll notice kind of just right off the bat is that this is a training that is typically put on by 4 different presenters. And you're only getting me today. And the reason for that is you've already heard a bit from David, and I think a piece of what he would typically present in this training is part of what you already got, so we are not repeating that piece of it. But Ilana and Alexis and actually the rest of my team are all in the Critical Race Theory Summer School conference that's going on all week, specifically talking about kind of the backlash against critical race theory that's going on in our public education system. And that is put on by the African American Policy Forum. This is their 3rd year of doing a summer school. It's absolutely one of the best professional development experiences that I have ever been in. But that is one of the reasons why you don't have my other team members here with us today. And I'll address that a little bit further in a moment. So the topic that we're going to talk about today is looking at the intersectionality of race, systems involvement, and disability in our education system with an eye towards creating more equity in our education system. So there has been legislation at both the federal level and in California, which is designed to promote equity in education. But despite that legislation, there are vast disparities that we still see in education outcomes among different types of youth based on identity, including their race, their foster care and probation status, as well as their disability. So while 85% of all students in California graduate high school within 4 years, only 78% of African American students graduate, 70% of youth with disabilities graduate, and only 56% of youth in foster care graduate within 4 years. Now, disproportionality in school discipline, as I'm sure you can probably all imagine, is actually even worse. So for suspension rates, for all California students is only about 3.5% of the population. For students with disabilities, it's 6%. African American students, it's 9%. And for youth in foster care, it's 15%. So we want to explore those disparities in our education, child welfare, juvenile justice system, but we need to look at it through an intersectional lens. And we need to also have some background in the historical, legal, and structural racism, classism, and ableism that are kind of creating those conditions. It's important to look at historical as well as current housing segregation and how that creates segregation within our schools, as well as looking at implicit bias. And all of those things will help those working on behalf of youth to better identify and address the impacts of these biases on our children at the policy level nationally and at the state and local level, as well as for anyone who's advocating it for individual children to address their education and special education needs. So it is not something that I'm going to ask you all to do today during our training, but if you've never done it, I do think it's really meaningful and impactful for people to take the Harvard Implicit Association test. And the reason why this is so important is because it gets to this idea that we are all kind of socialized and culturalized within the United States. And we are, a society kind of founded upon and created around white supremacy. And so we all have implicit biases. I have them, you have them, everybody has them. If you read books, if you watch TV, if you listen to people talk about politics, if you're on social media, these implicit biases are kind of, I like to think of it as like seeped into our brain in a way that we don't know that it's happening. And it comes up in our thoughts and it comes out of our mouth in ways that we, in many ways, are unaware of. And so becoming more aware of our implicit biases, we think is a really important step in serving our youth. So let's just talk about what is in this overall presentation, and then I'll talk a little bit about kind of what I think we're going to actually have time to get through today. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction and positioning, specifically in my own personal privileges, and I will do a bit introducing what critical race theory and intersectionality are. We then have about 45 to 50 minutes of this training is set in this kind of historical, legal, and structural racism background, and talks about kind of how our education system continues to be segregated kind of after the Brown versus Board of Education legal decision, and how that's based around kind of labor and employment and housing and income. Unfortunately, that is the section that David Noble from our team typically presents on, and it is one of the sections that I'm unfortunately not going to be covering today. But we are going to give you the slides. The content is in the notes. It's really meaningful context. And, one of the things I heard say today in my critical race theory summer school that I was just in is that you cannot figure out how to fix a problem unless you could diagnose the problem. And looking at that historical, legal, and structural racism and segregation background is how we get to diagnosing the problem. So even though I'm not going to cover it today, I think it's really, really important. So please, if you have a minute, go back and check that out. We also in this training typically spend about an hour talking about implicit bias and trauma, because that really impacts, and it gets into some of the really fun and interesting science about like how our brain works and how we categorize and how we use those categorized to kind of shortcut in our day-to-day life. And then what that does, when we are attempting to serve youth kind of in our wider world, that information is presented by my teammate Ilana. She is in the critical race theory summer school as we speak. And so we're not going to be able to cover that piece. Again, it's 4-hour training, and we're cutting it down to about an hour and a half today. But the content is there, it's in the slides, it's in the notes, it's very interesting stuff. So I would recommend that you check that out. And then the piece I am going to cover today in more depth is looking at disproportionality. And we come at this, we look at multiple systems, probation, special ed, school discipline. We come at it from some historical background. I provide some data. We talk about what the issues are, and then I will give you some kind of next advocacy steps around that. So wanted to give you all that overview. As you can see, Our typical panel of presenters is much more diverse than myself. And so, as I explained earlier, I think you guys have already had the opportunity to hear from David, which is really amazing. And Ilana and Alexis are in that critical race summer school. And I did not want to pull them out of that. That's a really important professional development opportunity for them. So you end stuck with me. I am a white woman. Some of this content may be difficult to hear from me. Fully acknowledge that and just want to say how important we feel that diversity is in presenting this presentation. But that is not something that you're going to get today. So I just want to be kind of really upfront about that, and encourage your self-care throughout our time here today, so that hopefully does not have a significant negative impact on you all. I do want to share just a bit of my background. I've been an education attorney for 17 years, and for the last 15 of those 17 years, I've been working exclusively with children in the child welfare and juvenile justice systems. I'm also a graduate of UCLA Law, where I received a certificate in critical race theory, and have continued in my studies in that area. Think that's a really important lens through which to analyze our systems, to understand what's really going on with our children and families, to accurately diagnose the problem, and then to try to figure out, how to support our communities as they find solutions that work for them. So, let's see. We also like to typically start this presentation with a clear statement of what our vision is. What do we want our education, child welfare, and juvenile justice system to look like? And we hope that this vision will help shape and frame kind of the content that I will be sharing today. And so, in the education world, we are looking for a culture of inclusion and dignity. We want there to be equitable funding and access to programs and services. We want there to be proportionate and high outcomes for all students. And we want our education leaders, our teachers, our principals to be diverse and to reflect the student bodies that they serve. In child welfare, we want to be keeping families together, and we want our system to be driven by the needs of the children and the families, not by the needs of the quote unquote system. And we also very clearly have a goal of eliminating racial disproportionality in things like detentions, removals, time out of care, whether kids are with kin or with strangers, etc. And then in the juvenile justice system, we think it's really important to keep kids in their homes and in their communities and not incarcerated, with a focus on rehabilitation and high quality community-based services. So I think it's also really important, as I mentioned before, I'm a white woman. I think it's important to start our conversation today with, touching on privileges. The definition of privilege that we use is that it is societally granted, unearned advantages that are given to some people and not others. And that these systemic or structural advantages impact people based on identity factors such as race, gender, sex, religion, nationality, disability, sexuality, class, and body type, just to name a few. There are so many ways to understand these different privileges, and I think that it is important to just touch on a few. I think we probably all understand race, ethnicity, or colorism, sex, gender, and orientation. There's also privileges, at least in our country, for people who speak English and who are citizens. There's lots of privileges around class, people being perceived as able-bodied and or minded, having access to high quality education from early education all the way through college and graduate school. We also find at the intersection of class and race that there are a lot of privileges related to access to justice, access to healthcare, to political participation, to positive media depictions. There's also many privileges found based on your feelings of safety in your community, as well as your ability to stand as an individual and only represent yourself instead of your identity group or groups. Again, there's a lot more in the slide notes about all of these different areas of privilege, and I do recommend that people go check that out if you'd like to learn more. So as I mentioned a few times, and as is probably also visually apparent, I'm a white woman. I have many, many privileges. I have privileges based on race, class, education, perceived ability, language, citizenship, health, political, media, community, and individuality. I'm also a woman in our patriarchal society who has experienced discrimination based on my sex and gender expression. My privileges specifically have allowed me access to high quality education, to choose a career I feel passionate about, to advance in that career, and obviously to be here with you today. So I also just want to do just a little bit of positioning within kind of my personal background related to critical race theory. So critical race theorists do believe that race is a social construct and that its meaning is created by all of us. And that meaning has changed over time. You know, one example of this is you can think about kind of early Irish and Italian immigrants. When they originally emigrated to this country, they were socially constructed to be of a lower race, but were eventually integrated into the definition of whiteness. Now, we know that racial inequalities emerge from social, economic, and legal differences that white people in positions of power have created to protect those property rights in that whiteness. And that's an idea taken from the work of Professor Cheryl Harris, a UCLA faculty member at the law school. And that those circumstances are what in many ways give rise to the poverty and the criminalization of our marginalized communities and communities of color. I also just want to mention, you know, there is a really clear kind of conservative backlash against critical race theory that is occurring in our country right now. And for anybody who's interested, for the critical race theory summer school that's going on all this week, put on by the African American Policy Forum, that is actually the entire topic of the conference being covered. They also run really amazing campaigns. One of them is called Truth Be Told, so I would recommend those who are interested to look more into that. But some kind of additional examples of this was the early Trump ban on teaching critical race theory and implicit bias in federal agencies, as well as the push in many states to remove anything viewed as currently as possibly related to CRT being taught in schools. And so these are curriculum bans and book bans that are going on kind of right now all across the United States. So CRT believes that racism is ingrained in the fabric and system of American society, and that institutional racism is pervasive in our dominant culture. And so really kind of any institution you can think of, education, healthcare, justice, policing, etc. It's there, you just have to kind of look for it. And once you've got the appropriate lens to look for it, it is not difficult to find. CRT rejects this quote unquote truth of meritocracy, that if you work hard, you know, you can achieve anything, and really talks about how systems are designed to kind of hoard kind of power and resources for those at the top. It rejects the idea that the law is neutral and colorblind, but really talks about and studies how the law is designed, again, to protect the power and privileges of those who are making the laws and creating and passing the laws. All right, so I mentioned just a moment ago, Professor Harris, one of my professors at UCLA who I've actually had the privilege of hearing speak again this week. Absolutely amazing. But she kind of coined this idea that whiteness is a property right, and it's this basis of racialized privilege, and that the status of white racial identity provides the basis for allocating societal benefits which are legitimated in the law as a type of property status. And so the idea here is that, even after legal segregation is outlawed, whiteness as property continues to serve as a barrier to effective change and operates to protect entrenched power. So the best example of this I can give for you is, Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, outlawed segregation in schools. 10 years later, pretty much the entire South's education system was still segregated. And we can fast forward to the current day, and we see that schools, our public education system, is basically still as segregated as it was in the 50s. And so this is this example of kind of the legal move. So, and I'll just give you kind of a very brief summary of the history section overview that we're not going to get into, which is, if you're pushed out of, not allowed to enter, if you're an African-American person and you're not allowed to enter the employment or wage earning system, we can start from the period of enslavement where you get nothing for your labor, and fast forward, all the way through the civil rights movement. You can look at like World War II, African-Americans fought valiantly in that war and came home and did not get the benefit of the GI Bill, which sent all of our white soldiers to college. After that, we have a construction boom where all these, single family homes were built. Many white people were able to get federally subsidized loans to move into that housing, build equity in that housing, and basically kind of bump their wealth up, where African Americans were almost specifically excluded or completely excluded. Which gives rise to this idea of kind of an inner city versus suburb. Then you have school districts created to basically fence off the suburbs. If our education system is funded on the basis of property values, obviously property values in the suburb are worth much more. And so we can see the way that the laws, are manipulated to allow for that to continue happening, to keep schools segregated, even though school segregation has been outlawed. So there's been lots of cases, again, discussed in the history section, talks about, why busing is not allowed, why urban and suburban school districts are allowed to perpetuate, why affirmative action has not been allowed in, getting into higher education. And so that section goes through a whole ton of that again, I think is really meaningful and worth looking at a little bit more closely. So now next we come to Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, Executive Director and founder of the African American Policy Forum, who coined the term intersectionality because of this need to account for multiple grounds of identity when considering how the social world is constructed. And so the idea here is that, she looked at some seminal employment discrimination cases and found that, in those cases, African-American women were not allowed to pursue claims of employment discrimination because, white women were promoted at this firm and African-American men were promoted at this firm. And so the fact that so there wasn't a sex discrimination going on, there wasn't race discrimination going on. And so the fact that African-American women were not being promoted at a firm and were actually excluded from pretty much all of the employment opportunities, the court in that case found that there was no discrimination there. And so this idea of intersectionality is, 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, right? 2 + 2 is 10, equals 10 or equals 100, that we have to look at overlapping identities and how the intersection of those identities cause, even additional barriers to accessing equity. All right, so here is where we are going to skip ahead. And let me get us to the right place. I will pause for just a minute to see if anybody has questions that they have come up or they want to contribute to the conversation. I'm definitely open to that. If anybody wants to come off of mute, you are more than welcome to. And I know it's a hot day. I was just outside. It's after lunch. Hopefully everyone is awake and I'm not putting you to sleep. All right, so we're going to start here with talking about kids with disabilities. And so I'm going to give you a very small little historical excerpt, and then we're going to look at current data and talk about kind of how we got here. So I think, turning now to the disproportionality in the special ed system, it's important to see how disproportionate outcomes, as well as overrepresentation and underrepresentation, are not accidental, they're not neutral, but they're actually baked into the history of our education system. They are baked into our current laws, how our special ed system currently works, both historically and currently, and that it has real consequences for our kids. So I'm just going to give you, again, just a really brief little background here. So as early as the 1890s, the U.S. Supreme Court held that exclusion from school of a boy with a disability because he was, quote, too weak-minded to derive benefit from instruction was deemed, quote, troublesome to other children and made, quote, uncouth noises. Now, we find similar sentiments in Supreme Court rulings in 1919. The court upheld the exclusion of a child because he had, quote, slow and hesitating speech, a particularly high, rasping, and disturbing tone of voice, an uncontrollable flow of saliva which drools from his mouth, which produced a depressing and nauseating effect upon the teachers and the other school children, close quote. Now, as you can see from both of those really early rulings, the needs and the comfort level of the non-disabled children and teachers were deemed more important than the education needs of the children with disabilities. And this is a trend we do still see today in our special ed system. So very often we see a kid who maybe is inattentive or impulsive or is acting out behaviorally. And, I go to IEP meetings all the time to represent kids, and I start hearing about a kid like that, and I automatically know that they're not going to recommend behavioral services to support that child. They're going to recommend putting him in a segregated classroom to get him out of the way of the quote unquote normal or typically developing children. And this is a really direct echo that we can see just from our very earliest cases. Now, these trends of exclusion and segregation continued into the 1950s and 60s. So many courts and state legislatures had decided that compulsory education statutes, basically that says that everybody's got to go to school, did not require providing education to children with mental impairments and actually criminalize parents for persisting in, quote unquote, forcing the attendance of children with disabilities if school officials deem them unable to, quote, profit from instruction. Now, because of the civil rights movement, Congress responded in 1965 with legislation to assist disadvantaged children, including funding to states for the education of quote unquote handicapped children. Unfortunately, that money only supported segregated education. So here we have the federal government saying, oh yeah, you really need to support these disabled kids, and here's money to create a separate segregated classroom for them. So during the 1960s, the disability rights movement was very inspired by the struggles and strategies of the civil rights movement, including that push towards desegregation. And in 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed, and it mandated that states that receive federal special education funds must educate all children with disabilities and provide them with a free, appropriate public education. And this law has been reauthorized many times since, but the basic rule is that kids with disabilities have a right to a free, appropriate public education. Now, again, the stated purpose of the law is that all students with disabilities receive that free, appropriate public education. I say that a couple times because that's our legal standard. And that includes special education and related services designed to meet the students' unique needs. However, this history of our special ed system makes clear that those early court decisions and legislation were focused on excluding completely and then segregating students with disabilities. Now, another important kind of intersection that we need to talk about is how the special ed system was actually used as one tool to subvert desegregation orders after Brown versus Board of Ed decision. So specifically, what happened was children were put on quote unquote ability tracks, where white children were commonly placed in accelerated classes, while children of color were placed in vocational training courses or referred to segregated special ed classes. And this helped create segregation within schools when they could not require it between schools. And this actually has a name. It's called second generation segregation. All right, so let's look at some of the data. So first of all, I want to differentiate for you all the difference between over and under identification and over and under representation. So it's helpful to think of identification as an individual level phenomenon and representation as a group level phenomenon. So it can both be true that just a single individual Black child can fail to be identified as having a disability when in fact they do have a disability. That's it under identification. And it can also be true that Black students generally are overrepresented as a group in the entire special education system. So the data you have on the screen comes from the 2018-2019 school year. And the reason why we use this data is that more recent data, for example, 1920, everything starts getting messed up because of COVID. So this is kind of the pre-COVID data. So moving from left to right, so we have the California student population by race and ethnicity. So just for example, white students made up 22.4% of all students in California. So then we have California youth in foster care by race and ethnicity, and then finally youth in foster care receiving special ed services by race and ethnicity. And what we're doing here is we're adding in kind of an identity factor, with the idea being kind of to show what intersectionality does. So in 1819, African-American students comprised about 5% of California's general student population, but they were 18% of children in foster care. So that's more than 3 times their base rate. So they are very clearly overrepresented in the child welfare system. And they were 22% of youth in foster care receiving special ed services, which is more than 4 times their base rate. So we can see that kind of intersectionality building on itself. So it's also really important to kind of dig a little bit deeper into the data and look at the different types of special ed eligibility categories. So not only are children of color, particularly African-American children, disproportionately overrepresented in special ed generally, but since the 1970s, the U.S. Department of Education Office of Civil Rights has reported persistent overrepresentation of children of color in specific disability or eligibility categories for special ed. So overrepresentation of African-American students and really students of color is found in eligibility categories that are more subjective. Those that rely upon clinical judgment of assessors, so we have subjectivity coming in there, where we know implicit bias can creep in, as well as categories that are more stigmatized and or have negative connotations, such as the category emotional disturbance. And you can see that labeled in the chart as ED. Less subjective categories, such as blindness or being visually impaired or deafness or being hard of hearing, we do find proportionality. And so it's just really interesting to look at, you know, if something is maybe diagnosed by a medical doctor after kind of an objective test, we see that students are kind of proportionally ascribed. But if we're looking at more subjective categories, you know, things are kind of all over the place and not in a good way. So let me give you an example. So again, African American students are 5% of the overall California student population, but they're nearly 13% of students classified as emotionally disturbed in California. So they're more than 2 times as likely as white students to be labeled as emotionally disturbed, while white students with very, very similar behaviors are often classified under the category of other health impaired. And these white students are basically found to have attention deficits, where the students in the emotionally disturbed category are found to have behavioral or emotional disabilities. And so again, these are kids who very often look kind of exactly the same, but the implicit biases of our teachers and school psychologists and counselors are kind of viewing those behaviors through different implicit bias lenses. So I'll just give you an example of this. A student who's not paying attention in class, maybe the white student is seen as inattentive or impulsive, but the Black student is maybe viewed as defiant, even though they're objectively doing the exact same thing. So if you have any familiarity with the special ed field, you are probably aware of the fact that emotional disturbance is one of the most stigmatized eligibility categories. And this disproportionate overrepresentation of African American students as ED is actually exacerbated for African American students in both predominantly white or predominantly wealthier schools or districts. So I want to just look at one more eligibility category here, and this is what's called ID, or intellectual disability. You'll see it's the second from the left on the chart. This is also formally known as mental retardation. And this, again, is one of the most stigmatizing labels. So African American students are 3 times more likely than white students to be labeled as having ID. And this is even after a 1980 case called Larry P. versus Riles, which actually occurred in LAUSD. And that case found that standardized intelligence testing was not appropriately normed for children of color and was disproportionately finding African American students to have an intellectual disability, even though they didn't. That's a really important point here. And after that 1980 case, in the aftermath, it is thought that many of the standardized intelligence testing is thought to have been more appropriately normed for children of color. But we know the issue has not been sufficiently addressed given the data that we still have disproportionality. And again, the ID label is even more likely to be given to African American students who attend schools in predominantly white or wealthy communities. I'll tell you, we have done some further research into the different types of standardized IQ tests that are out there, and we have found some that have less disproportionality in them. So if any of you are, studying psychology, thinking about being a school psychologist, might be somebody who's going to be testing kids for something like this, there is research out there. We're actually very happy to share it if you're interested, about which tests are less. None of them are perfect, but which tests have less disproportionality in their outcomes. So I think it's also important to talk about, once students are found eligible for special ed services, an IEP team then makes decisions about how to provide them with that free, appropriate public education. And again, we know from the research that African American and Latinx students are more likely than their white peers to be placed in segregated classrooms, with teachers judging their behaviors as aggressive. They're more likely to experience significant school discipline for behavior that is defined as quote unquote defiant, typically due to their race, and they ultimately experience more criminalization of schools. All right, so again, I think it's really important to kind of talk about this quote unquote presumed neutrality in the IDEA. We do have to keep in mind that, what is considered normal or acceptable is framed typically by a white middle class kind of heteronormative standard, such that those who don't conform to those norms experience negative consequences. And these norms are typically invisible, and that is actually the power that it has. And we find examples of this presumed neutrality and normative framing in standardized testing. So just to take a step back for a moment and talk about the history of standardized IQ tests. So they come from the eugenics movement, which began in the 1900s and actually peaked during the economic crisis of the Great Depression in the 1930s. Eugenicists specifically created and manipulated standardized testing in the 1920s to quote unquote prove that different intelligence level, the different intelligence levels of Black versus white people. So this is actually a tool that was specifically created with the sole purpose to justify racial subordination. So eugenicists in general believe that the human race would be improved if certain quote unquote unfit subgroups were prevented from procreating. And these unfit subgroups were typically low-income people of color and people with disabilities. Now, this may feel familiar to you because eugenicists were behind the Nazi Holocaust, which not only targeted people of color, of the Jewish faith, but also people of color, as well as people with disabilities very specifically. So again, we know from the disproportionality in the intellectual disability category that our current standardized testing has not been completely washed clean of this kind of original stain. And we can see that in the Larry P case, and we can actually see it in the aftermath of that case as well. All right. So I'm not going to go into it in depth. There's more in the slide notes for those who are interested. But there's also a type of special ed testing that looks at behavior rating scales. And those behavior rating scales are parents or teachers who look at the kid and say oh, they have this much aggression or this much depression or things like that. And those are really interesting because you have a kind of admittedly subjective rater, the parent, the teacher, et cetera. And so there's problems with kind of that type of testing as well. And it's really important to kind of look at the positionality and the identity of the student versus the teacher, that we know that about, I think it's 82% of all teachers in our country are white women. And so if we have a white woman who's subject to the same implicit biases we all have, kind of doing a behavior rating scale, let's just say, for example, on an African-American girl, you're gonna have implicit biases creeping into that behavior rating scale. So again, there's more on the slide about that for anyone who is interested. And we also have some additional resources that are kind of in their final stage of development that will be up on our website probably in the next couple of weeks that get kind of more into that as well. All right. So I also think it's really important to just touch on some specific aspects related to our current housing situation that does have implications for our special ed system, and these include both environmental and industrial racism. So many of you very likely already know this, but many low-income Black and brown neighborhoods are significantly impacted by industrial pollution and environmental hazards. And I'm just gonna, kind of go over a couple. So if we look at air quality, 61% of African-American children live in areas that exceed the EPA, so that's Environmental Protection Agency, ozone standards caused by oil and natural gas industry emissions, dirty emissions from power plants, and motor vehicle pollution, because many of them are located by, for example, freeways and highways. And so there's actually some direct scientific studies that link this type of pollution to causing about 1 of every 200 cases of intellectual disability. And that, again, kind of the studies extrapolate. I don't know how they do it, definitely not a scientist. But that potentially costs our country $289 million every year just in kind of lost human potential. This type of air quality problems also trigger pretty significant respiratory ailments, including asthma, which African American children have at twice the rate of white children. And again, the scientists' studies show that this accounts for about 10 million lost school days every single year. And that statistic comes from the CDC. Also, if you, for example, have an asthma attack in the middle of the night, you don't sleep well, you're very tired the next day, that type of kind of environmental racism leads to fatigue. And, you know, I can't tell you how many times I've sat in an IEP meeting and I'm told, well, your kid, he's just not trying. He lacks motivation. He doesn't have any effort. And, you know, it's his fault that he's failing in school. If he just tried harder, he would do better, without kind of accounting for kind of the health side effects that this kind of environmental pollution can cause. I'll also just quickly touch on lead poisoning. So African American children have twice the rate of dangerous and irreversible lead in their blood than white children. And this very often comes from deteriorating housing where lead paint peels from the walls and lead pipes deliver water to homes and schools. Again, we know from the scientific studies that children with lead poisoning drop a total of 23 million IQ points every single year. And this results in so much. It makes kids slower to learn, reduce their memory capacity. It actually creates learning disabilities, hyperactivity and impulsivity, leads to classroom disruptive behaviors and discipline problems, etc. And, you know, I think lots of people are aware with kind of food swamps and deserts. Food swamps are where they're, food deserts are where there are kind of no healthy, you know, fruits and vegetables and meats and things that can be found in a certain community. And a food swamp is kind of the opposite. The idea is there's maybe more like corner stores that have sugary, salty, kind of more unhealthy access to food. I think it's also really important to note that many children of color live in what is kind of termed a sacrifice zone. And that is kind of defined as communities that are assaulted by multiple environmental poisons and hazards. And there's more actually in the slide notes about kind of how you can get more information, specifically looking at water quality and testing. All right, so just to give some specific recommendations. All right, so there is an obvious vehicle to drive change for individual students with disability, and that's through their IEP, or what's called their individualized education program. And so, you know, there's a couple of things I think that are important to think about kind of in this kind of universe of helping kids at the individual level. So, you know, we've been thinking really hard about youth and caregiver voice, and kind of how do we value and highlight their perspective. So I'll just give you an example of this, you know, and I'll use an example I had earlier. You know, if you have an IEP team that's saying that kid's just not trying hard, they're lazy, they're unmotivated, you know, they don't have a disability, if they just tried harder, they'd be fine. It's this idea of meritocracy. If this kid just tried harder, he'd be fine, but he's somehow he or she is somehow to blame. And so, you know, we think a lot and have been trying to center, like, what is the lived experience of that child? What is the lived experience of that caregiver? How do we bring those voices into the IEP meeting in a really meaningful way? You know, if that boy says, or that little girl says, like, it's not that I'm not trying, it's that I'm exhausted. It's that I'm having an asthma attack every single night and I'm not sleeping. And like, this is a part of my disability. Like, this is like this quote unquote side effect of my disability. So that's just one example. You know, another example that we see quite a lot is, you know, and I'll go back to the other example I gave, white child is maybe inattentive, seen as having a disability, is provided services, Black child evidencing the very same behavior, but kind of defined as defiant, making bad choices, being a bad kid, etc. How do we bring the experiences, for example, of the caregiver into an IEP meeting about how, what they've been told and messaged by the teacher, what they've been told and messaged by the school. How do we flip this idea of like bad kid to like child with a disability in need of support? And how do we take the lived experiences of that youth and of that caregiver to kind of bring that view into the IEP meeting? So that's something we've been thinking, in addition to kind of all the typical special ed advocacy we do, making sure they get appropriately culturally normed tests, making sure they have access to the services that they are entitled to, right? Those are all really important pieces, but this other piece of kind of youth and caregiver voice and how their lived experience kind of informs what they're going through and what they need and how they define what they need and what they want is really important. We've also been thinking really hard about this data that's out there, right? Like I've just showed you some of the available data. How do we use this data in a meaningful way to impact IEP teams, to impact classrooms, to impact schools? A lot of that data that I just showed you was at the state level, but there is in the California data system called DataQuest. You can actually narrow things down. You can look at data district by district. You can look at it school by school. And how do we use that data to be clear with schools that like you are over disciplining African-American students, right? Like this is your data, this is what you're doing, and this is what you're doing to my client. And so how do we use that data to advocate more effectively for our kids and their families? All right, so I do want to spend probably our remaining time together today to talk a little bit more about school discipline. And again, I'm going to do a short kind of history component of this, and not so much that I'm like teaching you guys history you don't already know, but it's more about contextualizing our current situation so we can see kind of the through lines, so we can see how it's the same even though it's a little bit different, and we can kind of connect those histories in a way that I think is really meaningful. So specifically, we're going to talk about overrepresentation of kids of color, kids with disabilities, and kids in the child welfare and juvenile justice system in school discipline. But in order to do that, again, we're going to talk about this, what I call kind of racialized violence. And I'll be really clear, this is probably part of the hardest part of this training. So if you struggle to hear that from a white woman, I am okay with that. I'm not offended in any way. Mute me for 5 minutes and then come back and join me. So I just want to kind of have that disclaimer up front. All right. So again, it's important to frame this conversation about school discipline by looking back into our history, and particularly starting with this period of enslavement. And I think we, again, all know it's kind of horrible mistreatment of human beings, treating them as property, capturing, moving them, controlling every aspect of their life. And I think it's important to talk about how we see this mirrored in kind of these horrific images of what our children are going through in the violence that is caused them by school police, school resource officers, and security officers against, most particularly our children of color, but definitely also, again, children in the system and children with disabilities as well. So, I start again with this history of local law enforcement. agencies and kind of how and why they were created. Particularly in the South, local law enforcement started as quote unquote slave patrols. They're used to capture and return enslaved people who ran away from their masters. I think it's also important to look at the creation of police in the North. And the history there is that they were specifically created to protect the goods and property of the wealthy. So they were basically like capitalist protectors of property there too. Previously in the North, capitalists actually had to hire their own security forces to protect their goods. Let's say they owned a warehouse or a sawmill or, whatever. They had to hire private people to provide protection. But they were able to influence their local communities to create a public police force that basically spread the cost of that private protection amongst the entire community and protected the property of the wealthy with much less cost to the wealthy. So I think that kind of history is important as well. And we can reflect that also kind of into the current, right? We see this as a kind of a precursor of using police to quote unquote protect property over the lives and well-being of Black Lives Matter protesters. And we can also see that in the use of school disciplinary measures to protect school property over valuing the needs of students. So I'll jump to Reconstruction, which is the period directly after the Civil War, thought to span from 1866 to 1877. So during this time period, Congress passed a series of federal civil rights laws to protect formerly enslaved people. But there was a huge backlash by Southern whites, which quickly coalesced against the exercise of those rights, for example, the right to vote. And resulted in the formation of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, members of the Klan, many, if not all of whom were also members of local law enforcement, used violence or threats of violence to discourage Black people from exercising their rights, and basically were specifically designed to reestablish the previous racial and social order. So again, we see how white supremacy and the use of force and violence in order to control the quote unquote acceptable behaviors of Black people really kind of baked into the history of our culture and the history of law enforcement itself. So then we move to Jim Crow segregation, time period there is 1870s to 1965. Was in the South, really was bolstered by ongoing acts of violence against Black people, with really the express purpose of discouraging them from trying to challenge the racial order. So in thousands of documented cases, Black women, men, and children were lynched for alleged crimes, including disrespecting whites, and in many cases for no real reason at all. And, one of the things that kind of shocked me about this when I first learned about it many years ago when I was in college, is that these lynchings were public, they were communal events, white people brought their children to witness it, they were published in newspapers, people collected souvenirs, these were community, it was, you can think of the 4th of July picnic, everybody went. I think we can see echoes of this in our current era with the harm and violence caused to people of color at the hands of police or other vigilantes. In many ways, kind of the white majority's reluctance to see or address the problem. I think we also, again, see the origins of our subjective school discipline policies in this history. So, a lot of our school discipline is based on willful defiance. What is that if not policing the quote unquote acceptable behavior of people of color? We also see it in dress code violations, right? So, the way this was explained to me that really had an impact is, and I'm totally going to resort to stereotypes here, but I'm going to do it to make a point. So take a pair of shorts and put it on a relatively thin white girl, and it's probably quote unquote socially acceptable. And now put it on a young girl of color who maybe has a more voluptuous body. And all of a sudden, we can see kind of the hypersexualization of that young girl of color's body. And the same pair of shorts, acceptable for a white girl, not acceptable for a girl of color. And so we again see here kind of the policing of what is acceptable, with the white as the norm, and the body of color as in contrast to that quote unquote norm. So moving into the civil rights movement, 1950s and 60s, I think what's really interesting here, especially in kind of our day and age of social media, is that civil rights movement was gaining momentum just as television sets were first becoming more commonplace in kind of the individual American home. And civil rights advocates kind of understood the power of imagery and recognized how violence against protesters would play on the TV news. And so coverage of Black protesters being attacked by police officers, police dogs, and white citizens really helped strengthen the legitimacy of the civil rights movement in the eyes of the white American public. And again, I think we can see very similarly in our current day and age, cell phone recordings of shootings and killings of unarmed Black people, violence visited upon Black children in schools. All of that in our current day has kind of raised awareness about police brutality and increased support for the cause of Black Lives Matter. And so we can again see kind of the use of media as a tool of resistance. I'll also just mention here, I also see a really interesting parallel between the civil rights movement and our ongoing national reckoning, is that both of these have a really clear conservative backlash. So in the mid to late 1960s, there were hundreds of Black uprisings in cities across the country, the majority of which were incited by police violence against people of color. One of these occurred in the Watts neighborhood in LA in 1965. In that specific instance, there was a violent arrest of a Black motorist suspected of drunk driving, and a 6-day uprising occurred afterwards. Many conservatives at that time blamed events like the Watts uprising on the civil rights movement, instead of focusing on the actual cause, which was police violence against people of color. And so this is kind of a law and order rhetoric. It allowed policymakers at the time to pass legislation that increased local police budgets, led to more arrests and incarceration in poor Black neighborhoods. This is also often framed as like the war on crime popularized by President Nixon in the 70s. So again, I think we're seeing a similar backlash today to the protests of the Black Lives Matter movement. So I think, again, this takes the form of media characterization of peaceful protests as riots. Concern that I think we can see all over the media these days about the rise in crime and violence, as well as kind of the Trump ban on diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings in the federal government, and the book bans and the bans on teaching kind of racial consciousness at the K-12 and higher education level that we are seeing now as well. All right, so then the 1980s saw the introduction of the war on drugs under President Reagan. The so-called drug and crime epidemics in urban areas were used as justification to, again, significantly increase the federal budget for law enforcement and the kind of co-occurrence of the reduction of federal programs for drug treatment. Every single available scientific study out there demonstrates that white and Black people use drugs at the exact same rate. Yet, as we, I think, probably all know, our jails, prisons, and juvenile detention facilities are disproportionately populated with adults and children of color. So obviously, we have some selective enforcement of drug laws occurring based on race. As many of you probably heard, stop and frisk, people of color are much more likely to be stopped and searched under the Supreme Court's Terry decision, that's the stop and frisk rule, which allows for blatant racial profiling, and children of color are more likely to be suspected of drug use and searched on and around school campuses as well. Adults and children of color are also more likely to receive longer jail sentences for the same crime as white children and adults. And just one example of this is the mandatory federal sentencing guidelines that were established during the Reagan administration, which required the same sentence for 1 gram of crack, which was viewed as a quote unquote black drug, as for 100 grams of cocaine, which was viewed as a white drug. And 1 gram of crack is equivalent to 1 gram of cocaine in terms of like drug potency. So the 1 to 100 differential there obviously led to overrepresentation. Now, currently, it's not 1 to 100. The ratio is only 1 to 18, but there's obviously still a really clear racial discrepancy there. And then, excuse me. Last thing I'll mention, and then we'll be done with history, the Clinton administration also got tough on crime and created increasingly harsher criminal sentences, including mandatory minimums and 3-strike laws that sentence primarily people of color to longer and longer sentences. This led to mass arrests and incarceration of Black people in particular. Currently, Black men make up only 6.5% of the US population, but they are 40.2% of our prison population. Blacks are incarcerated at 6 times the rates of whites for identical drug offenses. And just as like a fun thought experiment, could you imagine the social upheaval our country would experience if the situation were reversed? I always love to just pose that question because it makes my brain just like explode. And the reason why I mentioned kind of what the Clinton administration did is because this is also the kind of tough on crime rhetoric that was echoed in the zero tolerance school policies that also came into effect during this time. We see really similar statistics in the juvenile criminal legal system. But before we talk about that, let's talk about school discipline. All right. So again, we're looking at 18-19 school year data pre-COVID. So African-American students are nearly 4 times as likely to be suspended as white students. And this includes being disciplined more often for relatively minor infractions. African-American students are also 40% of those expelled, even though they're only 15% of the student population. African-American and Latinx youth are 70% of school discipline cases referred to the police. Many of these referrals come directly from teachers, who I mentioned before, about 82% are white and female. Even though, again, all the available research tells us that students do better when they have teachers of their same race. So in California, again, 18-19 school year, our suspension rate demonstrates disproportionality by race, foster care status, and disability, as well as the intersectional and exponential impact of all of those identities combined. So if we look at the graph, the 4 grouping of students from left to right are students by race, students with disabilities by race, youth in foster care by race, and students with disabilities in foster care by race. So again, we're building identities and looking at intersectionality. And this is a statistic you heard from me about an hour ago. Suspension rate for all students is 3.5%. Students with disabilities is 6. Students in foster care is 15. Students in foster care with disabilities is 19. And again, we're looking at that interaction of disability and foster care status. And then we layer race right on top of that, and it gets even uglier. So for African Americans, again, 3.5% of all students, but 9% of African Americans are suspended. 14% of African Americans with disabilities are suspended. And for African Americans in foster care, it's all the way up to 22%. And African American students in foster care with disabilities, all the way up to 24%. So again, we can really see that intersectionality in that data. And I often get questions about why, right? Why are our kids over-disciplined so much? Hopefully you guys know a lot of these answers, and the answers are obvious at this point, but it's a long list. We have explicit biases, implicit biases. We have those biases built into individual people. We have those biases built into our education system as a whole. Schools kind of have an increased reliance on school pushout, and that could be suspension, expulsion, but also informal school discipline policies. And we hear this a lot, like, you can't really, this school is not a good fit for you, you should go somewhere else. We also see this in kind of a pattern of discipline that just makes a student feel unwanted and uncared for, which, increases dropout rates. We've got zero tolerance policies, having school police on campuses, or schools that quickly call in police to address minor school discipline issues, the defunding of mental health services, including counselors and other supports for students, etc. So I think it's also kind of important to put this in, again, to kind of a larger context. So, the FBI reports that white males between the ages of 13 to 18 are the most likely to initiate a school-based shooting. Yet we also know that schools that are mostly comprised, if not solely comprised, of youth of color have the highest degree of metal detectors, security officers, school resource officers, school-based probation officers, and security guards. And this is not surprising. I'll just tell you, here in California, there is a law going through the legislature right now that we are almost positive is going to be passed and signed by the governor, that puts basically a new law in place that says that if anybody suspects any student in any way of possibly, participating in kind of a mass casualty incident, that they are required by law to immediately report that to law enforcement. And, most school officials, teachers, principals, et cetera, if they thought a kid was going to participate in a mass casualty incident, would totally call the police, right? Like, I don't think you really need a law for that. But I think those of us in the advocacy community are really concerned that this is going to be used to, increasingly criminalize children of color. And just to give you an example of this, in the law specifically, it talks about like depictions of guns. And I don't know if you guys know any like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds. They're obsessed with guns, especially little boys. Like I have a 5-year-old nephew, and he draws guns all the time and practices shooting guns all the time. Those are the types of things that would trigger this law and would require a referral to law enforcement, even if it didn't have anything to do with like actually killing anyone. It was just like normal child play. And so, this is real, and that is in response to Uvalde, and obviously Uvalde was an absolute tragedy, but we can see, I think really specifically, again, how these laws are going to continue to over-criminalize our children of color. We also know that schools with more secure school resource officers do record more crimes to law enforcement, basically meaning that they are like ticketing and arresting more kids. And those include crimes that involve weapons and drugs, and also those that are non-serious. And this basically creates what we call net widening, or expanding the reach of the criminal legal system kind of into our schools in an even bigger way. We also know that the research tells us that increases in the presence of police on campuses does not lead to lower crime rates on campuses. And so again, kind of all of this school discipline is not really necessarily about making schools safer. It's probably more about making some children, read that white children, safer at the expense of other children, read that children of color. All right, so also just touch on this idea of multiple suspensions. So that first data that we just looked at was like each kid got suspended once, but this data is kids who get suspended more than one time. And I think this data is actually really kind of meaningful to look at as well. And this is also where we can see implicit bias of teachers creeping in. So there was a study that found that teachers are more troubled by the second infraction of an African-American student than of a white student, and that they typically push for stronger disciplinary actions to be taken against these African-American students, again, having a second or third infraction. So I think that's really important to like look at how the implicit bias actually is found in the study and then plays itself out in the data as well. All right, so I'm just going to do a little bit on the criminal justice system, and then I think we will call it a day, and I'll give you guys back about a half an hour of your time. So intersectional disproportionality in school discipline, looking at race, ethnicity, class, disability, and foster care, really clearly contributes to disproportionality in the juvenile justice system. And I'll just make a note about language here. You know, saying the juvenile justice system at least implies that there's justice occurring. And that is something that I don't believe in. And so if you haven't heard me say it already, what I typically say these days is the juvenile criminal legal system. I think that's just more an accurate description. There are sometimes we do say juvenile justice system, and that's because it, that's how it is defined in a study, or it's required for clarity. But my new terminology is the juvenile criminal legal system. All right, so data tells us that almost 2,000 children are arrested every single day in the US, and that's about 1 every 45 seconds. Like, every time I read that statistic and just sit with it for even just a minute, it just rips my soul out. Like, these are children. So yeah, there's that. We do know that about 14 million children in the US attend schools who have police officers on campus, but do not have counselors, nurses, school psychologists, or social workers. So this does not, unfortunately, shock me. And I think it talks about our priorities, right? If we are prioritizing the funding of police and resource officers on school campuses over providing mental health professionals and supports, schools will use the resources that they have available. And if those resources criminalize typical childhood behavior, children will be criminalized. So, I think that's important to kind of think about when we think about solutions. What's kind of another interesting kind of turn of the data, the majority of all children in the US that are arrested are actually white children. But that we know that of the 62% of all kids that are arrested in the US who are white, somehow 67% of kids in the juvenile criminal legal system are children of color. And that breakup is 41% Black and 21% Hispanic. So something is actually happening between arrest and actual involvement in the juvenile criminal legal system that is giving white kids a break. It's letting them off the hook. They're not kind of getting all the way through the system, and is really clearly disproportionately hurting kids of color. Now, a lot of this has to do with the discretion and the implicit biases of prosecutors, because that is someone who is making the decision about whether or not to charge a kid and what to charge a kid with. So children of color constitute about 34% of children nationwide, but they're 87% of those who are placed in public juvenile criminal facilities. So not only are kids of color being kind of over prosecuted, they're being overly detained while that prosecution is going on. And there's additional factors that we lay onto this that have a really big impact. So age makes a difference. Only 1 in 64 white boys are taken into custody before their 8th birthday, but 1 in 13 Black boys are before their 8th birthday. That is absolutely so fucked up. I'm sorry, excuse my language. Disability also matters. So at least 1 in 3 youth in the juvenile criminal system have a disability that qualifies them for an IEP. And that's about 4 times the rate of youth with disabilities in public schools. So that's kind of an ableist bias that we see there. And sexual orientation also has an intersectional impact here. So the percentage of LGBTQ plus children in the juvenile justice system is about 20%. which is thought to be more than 2 times that of youth in the general population, found to be at about 7 to 9%. So there's clearly kind of a heteronormative bias, including happening there as well. We also know that children of color are disproportionately pushed into the adult criminal system by prosecutors, specifically where they are tried as adults. In 2018, Black youth were less than 15% of the total youth population, yet were 52% of youth prosecuted in the adult criminal court, making them 9 times more likely than white youth to receive an adult prison sentence. And so again, we can kind of see this racial empathy gap and implicit biases of prosecutors and judges related to Black youth, who very often are kind of quote unquote seen as men. So just some real quick policy recommendations. I think it's really important to look at what data we have as well as what data is missing. So as kind of my beloved Professor Kimberly Crenshaw says, if you can't see a problem, you can't fix it. And so you have to have data to see what these problems are, to diagnose them, and then to try to address them. So we have made large advances in the available data around education for kids in the child welfare or family regulation system, but we totally lack data specifically in California for youth involved in the juvenile criminal legal system. I think I can probably assume that the education outcomes of those youth are really low, but without the actual data, as an advocate working on behalf of youth, it's really hard to push for resources and services for those youth as a group without having the data to prove their need. I think another thing that's really important to talk about is there is a lot of, again, data for youth in the foster care system. But most of the data points are predicated on youth being stable in school, and youth in foster care are totally not stable in school. They are, attend an average of 8 schools while they are in care. And so, if you're looking at a data point that says how many youth graduate from the same school after starting high school 4 years ago, and you're trying to hold a school accountable for that graduation rate, if you have a kid who's been to 8 different high schools, which school are you holding accountable? So there are some kind of gaps in the data system and really in the accountability system that don't account for the instability of our young people that need to be addressed as well. So, probably a lot of you have heard there's been a lot of work around defunding school police and diverting resources from school police back to counselors, social workers, restorative justice programs, and kind of other types of support services. And that is really important work. There's been a great successful campaign in Oakland around that, as well as work that's been going on in LAUSD. Youth-led efforts specifically in LAUSD have reduced the school police budget by $25 million per year, which is amazing. They also ensured, at least pre-Uvalde, that school resource officers were totally removed from campuses, and they also banned the use of pepper spray on students at campuses. So really amazing youth-led work done there. But the work is not done. So, they cut the school police budget by $25 million a year, and there's not a single school police officer on a campus, yet LAUSD still spends $52 million per year on their school police budget. So I don't know what they're doing with that money, but that is a whole lot of money that should be kind of being spent on kids. So kind of last but certainly not least, there are a variety of ways in which we give children less rights than we give adults in the criminal legal system, in ways that are kind of inherently coercive, inherently unfair, and that really kind of need to be addressed. So, this Clinton era zero tolerance policies that have put in place, we really need to take those out. Kids are part of this training is around trauma and how trauma impacts the brain, how trauma impacts the body, how trauma impacts behavior. And once we understand that, we know that kids are not necessarily reacting in ways because they're quote unquote bad kids. They're reacting to trauma, to individual trauma, community trauma, etc. And so once we know how trauma is impacting kids, those kids should not be disciplined because of being triggered by trauma. And so that's a really important point to make here. We also know the research is really kind of clear. Restorative justice models are much more impactful than zero tolerance discipline. And so looking at how are we addressing kind of behavioral needs of kids in schools, I think that's really important. And then, again, we have to look at the constitutional rights of our children. We as adults all have constitutional rights, but for some reason we think that our kids deserve less than us, which I think is not right. So, currently schools, school resource officers, school administrators, teachers, etc., can search a student's person, possession, or lockers without a warrant. I don't know why we decided that was okay for kids, but not for adults. School administrators, SROs, and school staff can question a student about behaviors that can lead to their involvement in the juvenile criminal legal system kind of indiscriminately. Typically almost always without a parent or guardian present. There was a new law that was passed that says if a child is in custody, they have to have a parent present before they can question them. But how the heck is a kid going to know whether they're in custody or not, right? Kids are taught to respect authority. And if a police officer says, come sit down, tell me what you did, just because that kid is not in handcuffs doesn't mean that kid thinks they're going to be able to walk away and therefore they're not in custody. So a child's ability to kind of navigate these complex protections and is just not, I think, realistic. And those statements, oral statements, written statements, those statements absolutely are used against them in expulsion proceedings, in criminal legal proceedings. And that's a violation of their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. So I think the last thing I just want to show you all really quickly, one of the things that I love about this training is in putting it together, it required me to do a lot of learning. So at the end of this PowerPoint, for those of you who are interested, there's a whole lot of kind of continuing professional development. I'm a book nerd, and so books are my love language. This section is specifically for teachers. So, creating dignity in schools, culturally responsive teaching, how to do kind of collaborative, more culturally responsive teaching. There's some really excellent lessons plans in the Teaching for Black Lives book. This is a really great report that's got some great lesson plans for talking about police violence. Same here. And then if you actually look in the notes for this slide, you will see kind of a long list kind of by topic of further readings. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Taylor. You guys were awesome. I will throw my email in the chat if anybody wants to follow up with me, questions, get more resources. I really enjoyed spending time with you all today. Thanks for having me.
Let's all give Jill a round of applause for her talk today. Thank you so much, Jill, as always, for your expertise and your passion for this work. I have to say that as your colleague now for, you're not going to believe this, 10 years.
Love it.
It's really amazing to see the evolution and the, I think, ongoing integration of what we know is true for our families to be incorporated into this work with respect to issues concerning bias and racism. So it's really amazing to see. And I am so thankful that I was here today for this talk. And as always, for the opportunity to learn from you, no matter what it's about. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Any questions from the students for Jill?
I'll just say, I was as a solo presenter, not able to monitor the chat as well, but I am just looking at it right now. And I did see a couple of things in there that I would love to react to.
Of course.
So I think part of it was about kind of the environmental racism, and what should public health experts be tackling around that. This is not my area of specialty. I kind of look at this from a sideways perspective of how that environmental racism is impacting kids at school and their learning and their brain development and their health. So I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in this field, but I will say, part of what we missed is how do our community, right, the history that I did not cover today, it's like, how do our communities of color be so segregated in kind of these environmentally damaging areas? Like, why are the freeways built by them? Why are they located by all of the trash dumps, then the landfill, right? And so I think that there is a lot of history related to kind of housing regulations and laws and zoning. So like, absolutely, I think public health experts need to be tackling that issue, but I think that those are also like local zoning laws. And things that like, I think we could all become more involved in our local community around things like that. So I think that in many ways, these issues are kind of cross systems in a way that I'm not gonna pretend to be an expert in. So I wanted to just say that. I love the comment about pre-K expulsion. It's really interesting, kind of the data and the research talk about how you have expulsion. So like a kid does something, a principal decides to expel them, the child goes to an expulsion hearing, but then you have all this other school push out, which is like, you can't come here anymore. And we see that really significantly at the preschool level. I think the data is like kids are quote unquote expelled, AKA asked not to come back, 12 times more often at the pre-K level than at the K-12 level. And that is obviously has a huge racial disproportionality there as well. So I love that point. Yeah, and I think I will just echo, the Uvalde shooting, at least in California, has had a significant chilling effect in the campaigns to pull police out of schools. And we've seen it. We saw it with this new law being pushed through. We see it, the advocates in LAUSD were actually at a school board just, I think, 2 weeks ago, able to stop the rollback of putting police back into schools in response to Uvalde. So I think that that's real, but I also think that if we don't just respond out of fear, but we use like actual data and statistics about like who is most likely to commit these crimes, whether school police on campuses actually protect kids, right? I think the new report just released about Uvalde kind of speaks to that as well, right? If we try to like not activate our amygdala and not respond in fear and, really use our prefrontal cortex and use our brains and like really analyze the problem, I think we can come up with workable solutions. But this like gut reaction of responding in fear and getting all the police back in and, locking all the doors and putting everybody through the metal detector, like that is the kind of immediate response there. And it's hard to fight against that. Yeah, I will say if you go on the African American, so about the anti-CRT bills, so I think it's important to talk about like critical race theory, which is a practice done by lawyers, and like race consciousness, which is teachers teaching about race and history in classrooms. I do think those are different things. I think the kind of anti-CRT hysteria conflates those things. But yeah, so if you go to the African American Policy Forum's website, they have done a survey of all of the past, like as enacted laws and then proposed laws that are kind of anti-CRT in all of the states, all across all 50 states. They're tracking that really, really closely. They've got some great visuals you could check out around that if you're interested in learning more. All right. I think that's it. I'm happy to take more questions, but that's kind of this, I think the stuff I would pull out of the chat so far.